On March 16th, I'm going to be in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Longtime listeners might grasp the significance of this. It has been a year and a half since I left, and the person who bought me out of the lease there, they didn't last very long, not even a year, but it has since been taken over by new owners, and they extended an invitation to me, so I am returning. I'm going to be doing a workshop in the afternoon from 2 to 4:30 p.m. That costs just a bit of money. You can register for that through my website. I'm also going to be doing a live podcast recording in the evening from 8 to 9:30 p.m. That's totally for free. You don't need to register. You can just show up. I've got some very special guests joining me. Amy Matthews is going to be there. Sam Chase is going to be there. And the audience will also have an opportunity to get in on the conversation. It's going to be a very special event. I'm really looking forward to it. So if you're in the New York metro area, or you can manage to get to the New York metro area, I want to encourage you to join me. Saturday, March 16th, Williamsburg, Brooklyn. You can find out about the workshop in the afternoon and the live podcast recording in the evening by going to jbrownyoga.com. All right, here we are. Can you believe it? This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If it's your first time here, let me welcome you. If you're returning, what's up? How was your week? I hope you managed to keep it together. Me, I did okay. Unfortunately, time has conspired against me, and I'm right up against the deadline again. I hate when that happens, but I'm barely getting this out to you. I'm going to be up late making it happen. I think it's because I was quite consumed this week with tackling a very grouchy task, which was getting my head out of the sand when it comes to my finances. Those of you who've been around may remember a few weeks ago, I disclosed my income for 2018. And I've been really reflecting on why I chose to do that. It was part of a process that I have been going through in getting honest with myself about some stuff that I've really been just in denial about. And that process has culminated in a new blog post that I just put out this week. It's called Truth and Yoga in Spreadsheets. And for anybody who is grappling with the contradictions between yoga as a spiritual practice or a soul endeavor and yoga as a business pursuit, I want to encourage you to check out this blog post. I'm working through these issues and I'm curious to hear what you think. And today's talk with Rama, Jyoti, Vernon is very much on point in this regard. Rama Jyoti is someone who played a pivotal role at a very important inflection point. Those of you who listen on a regular know there's an ongoing theme of how did we get here? How did yoga get from this underground thing to this mainstream thing? And why do we have 200-hour teacher trainings like this? And why is it that yoga has become so fitness-oriented when people who really endeavor to the depths of practice know that it's so much more than that? Well, Rama Jyoti Vernon is the right person to be talking to about this because she knows exactly how we got here. And it was a very random occurrence that I got this opportunity to talk to her. Her colleague Jenny was in touch with me some while back and sort of put it on the table. Would I be interested? And I said, of course, I would love to talk to her. But then it didn't seem like it was going to happen, honestly. And then out of nowhere, I got a quick email, and then 2 days later, it happened. So it was one of these out of nowhere conversations with what I call the yoga unicorn. And then, of course, whenever I have an episode like that where there's a guest that I'm very excited to talk about. It's a really important conversation that I really want to have. That's when the technology gets all messed up. Like, I go for almost a year now. I haven't had any technical problems with any of the episodes I've recorded. Everything's been pretty smooth. And then all of a sudden, I get a chance to talk to Rama, Jyoti, Vernon, and like the gods of the tech world just frown upon me. So, for one, Rama Jyoti was on a flip phone, and then I had to go through a couple of different possibilities. Finally, it was like plan C. I managed to make it happen. So, I think the quality's okay, but just to know, it was really quite an undertaking to make this happen. And you will hear there's quite a lot of insight to it. And I'm sure some important conversations to come out of it as well. I'm very excited for you to hear it. Before we do, let me say something to anyone who is managing a studio and using Mind Body Online. I'm betting at one time or another, you were pulling your hair out and wishing there was something else that you could use. Well, there is, and it's called KarmaSoft. Longtime listeners have heard me talk about KarmaSoft before. They've been sponsoring us for a while. I used KarmaSoft myself when I had my center in Brooklyn. Rudy Senecal, the owner of KarmaSoft, has been on the show before. Go back and listen to the episode. You can hear all about the company and about how different the experience of using KarmaSoft is, how you're dealing with the real person and not a corporation, and how the product is just designed and made to work for like the independent studio. It doesn't have a million bells and whistles. It just has what you need. So if you or someone you know has to do the work of scheduling classes and doing the accounting, all of that can be made far easier by using KarmaSoft. Go check it out at karmasoftonline.com. Okay, as I mentioned, it is late and I'm up against the deadline, so we are going to get straight to it. Let me just remind you again that I'm going to be in Williamsburg, Brooklyn on March 16th for a workshop in the afternoon and then a live podcast recording in the evening. You can find out about that along with the blog post I was talking about, as well as all of my online yoga video stuff. Everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. All right, so I will touch base with you on the other side briefly just to let you know who's coming on next week and whatnot. But let's just go ahead and get to this conversation that I had with Rama Jyoti Vernon.
Hello, Jay.
Yes, hello.
Are you there?
I'm here.
Good. I think that worked. I think it worked.
Oh, fantastic. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, sorry about the bit of confusion. As I said, the tech conspired against me, but I came up with an alternate solution, and right now everything looks like it's working just fine. So if you're okay, I'm okay.
I'm okay. You're okay. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it. And thank you so much. We've never met before. We do have some mutual friends, I think, but it's just a great pleasure to have this opportunity to meet with you today. So thank you for this time. I do appreciate it.
Thank you, Jay. And I just want to acknowledge the wonderful work that you're doing.
Well, I'm a little bit, I don't even know where to start with you. You are one of the people that I call a yoga unicorn. For someone like me, I came into yoga in like the early 90s in New York City. And so now I'm in my 40s. I had a yoga center for 10 years in Brooklyn, and I sold 2 years ago.
Oh my goodness.
So I started this podcast like 3 years ago or something. And really it's been sort of this process of kind of sorting through how yoga went from this completely underground thing to this completely mainstream thing. And like a little bit about what the profession is now. So for me, like I've talked to a lot of people over the years now too. Your name has come up kind of again and again among different people. when they're telling their stories. So that's what I mean when I say you're kind of a yoga unicorn. I know you're often referred to as one of the first yoga teachers in the United States.
Yes, unfortunately, I was. I wish it had been better known. I started in the 1950s, 1955.
Wow. The other thing, again, there's so many things I want to ask you about, but, the other thing I noticed is, I was born in Los Angeles in 1972, but I didn't hear anything about yoga until I left, Los Angeles and went to New York.
Yeah.
I see here, I have a note that you started doing meditation as early as 1946 in Los Angeles. And I'm wondering, what was that like? Where was there meditation in 1946 in Los Angeles?
Oh, it was, my parents, my mother and father were holistic healers and chiropractors and reflexologists. My mother was one of the first in the nation to do reflexology. And my father was one of the first chiropractors in the early part of the century. He was born in 1884. He was the age of my grandfather. And we had a school of naturopathy in our home that I grew up in LA, right off Wilshire Boulevard. Great big home. And they had people coming, like it was the mecca of holistic healers in those days. And so they had meditators and, Norman Vincent Peale and Edgar Casey's people came and Bernard Jensen and all of those people, Adele Davis. These are people you may not have heard of. I don't know.
Edgar Casey, somebody I read a lot about. He's a very intriguing person. So is this sort of, as early as 1946, there was this, so is that like the New Thought movement? Is that what we would call this?
Yes. Well, no, the New Thought hadn't taken. Well, yes, because I studied with Ernest Holmes, the founder of the Church of Religious Science, which is New Thought now. Mm-hmm. But it really was ancient thought, because once I got into the yoga scriptures and studying Sanskrit, I discovered that what the yogis said thousands of years ago is really what the New Thought movement was about.
I know, it's
so
sort of
the
silly.
New Thought was really,
I was just going to say, it's sort of silly that we call it New Thought, because it is ancient, right?
It's ancient, yeah. Yeah, the whole thing of positive thinking, what we hold in mind, manifests. It's all in the 3rd chapter of the sutras, and some in the 2nd chapter. And it's fascinating. But as a child growing up in that environment, we had health foods and we just had a very different lifestyle than most people. And my mother went to study with Yogananda, and she was part of the Vedanta centers that were established by Swami Vivekananda when he first came to this country in the late 1800s. And so she was part of all that, and people would do meditation classes in our home. So, and I didn't know there was any other way.
Wow, that's interesting, because, in 1946, it had to be even more underground than it was in 1992.
Oh, yes. But LA was the most open place in the entire United States, Mm-hmm. And even Master Yogananda's guru, they scanned the continent, the North American continent, and they found that in LA was where more light was pouring in, which is interesting because it's called the City of Angels. Mm-hmm. And that's why he started his place in the Pacific Palisades and Encino and all of that.
So
but there were people our home was a mecca for people of like minds, mm-hmm. And the health was the closest you could get to spirituality, generally speaking, in those days. People were preparing their temple of God, their bodies. And that was so my parents were just before the leading edge of various things.
And
so they were
you were carrying on the family business, sort of, right?
Yes, I guess I never thought of it. But then I look back and my mother took me to my first yoga teacher, where the name was used. And that was in 1955 when we then moved from LA to Sacramento, where I was born. But I was so glad I had those formative years in Los Angeles because people were so much more open than other areas. So much more open to these spiritual teachings and to yoga.
Wow. So what was the yoga scene like in San Francisco in 1955?
Well, I was in Sacramento and I moved to San Francisco but there was no yoga. This was a teacher that was traveling through from India. He was a great Sikh master, and he was just giving a workshop for people who had heart attacks and strokes. And my mother insisted I go with her. And I was not healthy as a 15-year-old. I was had ill health and tired and couldn't sleep at night, had insomnia and anxiety and things like that. And she took me to this teacher. He was 84 years old. And he was a very tall Sikh master with a blue turban matching his blue suit. I was very impressed by that and the superficiality of it. And I sat there with all these older people in wheelchairs, and I thought, what am I doing here? I'm not old, and I haven't had a stroke or heart attack. And all of a sudden, he had these eyes like fierce, like lightning bolts. And he looked at me suddenly, and he said, "You need to be here." He read my mind, basically. And it was like I was so startled. And he gave these pranayama exercises. And people asked him if he did the headstand, and he demonstrated it at 84 years old. And I was very impressed with this teacher, and then tried to do the breathing exercise after that. And then somehow I found Yogananda's book of Autobiography of a Yogi, and I started reading it at 16 years old, and I felt like I had come home. You probably have had that feeling when you found yoga.
I think a lot of people I've spoken to who come on this show have said the same thing. There's sort of a moment, that very first Shavasana or whatever, where they're like, "Oh, this is where I want to live."
Let me just stay here forever.
Or just there's some glimpse into possibility and kind of power of the universe, or something that it's sort of undeniable, and sometimes not many words to describe it.
Right. Well, I think when the time is right, we're drawn to that which fits us. Mm-hmm. And so I was all I knew was pranayama. I started meditation at 5 years old with Ernest Holmes on how to overcome any pains that you have. And, it's positive thinking, which is the new thought. And that's what I studied as a child. And then as a teenager, I started doing pranayama, but I hadn't found the asanas yet. And I did pranayama and the reading of Yogananda, and there were only just few little books out on this subject then. Mm-hmm. And then I found the asana in San Francisco from Walter Magana Baptiste. And I knew Baron Baptiste when he was just a little baby.
That's what I was going to ask. That's Baron Baptiste's parents.
Yes. And then Baron, when he was 3 years old, came over to my son's birthday party, and they interacted a little bit. And he was just this little guy. And so basically that was all the yoga that was in San Francisco. And then when my husband and I moved to the East Bay, I got a call from the recreation center if I would teach yoga. And I didn't want to, but my husband accepted for me because I wasn't home at the time. and they printed their flyers and I couldn't go back on it, Mm-hmm. And so I was scared to death. I never wanted to teach yoga, ever. Mm-hmm. And I taught one class for teenagers. And if you can do that, Jay, you can do anything.
Yes, I imagine. So I've got a 9-year-old who acts like a teenager, but working with kids is its own ball game, it seems to me.
Yes, yeah. They're very advanced today, aren't they? These young kids, they're amazing.
Yes, more and more. Well, but so wait a second. So you, how did that first class go? Do you remember? Did you like it?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And in those days, I taught like the Baptiste did. It's where you breathe with the asana, which later my story is very interesting about the breath and asana, and candlelight and music. I had the Zen music just came out. I think Paul Winters did it inside the Taj Mahal. I think it was something like that. And I played this record in candlelight, and they loved it. In fact, one of the teenagers in the class just contacted me last year, 50 years later. She called me to say it changed her entire life. And so then the Recreation Center asked me to do a class for adults. And there were 40 people that signed up. And it was more like a meditative movement, where asana was like a moving meditation. And that's how I originally taught it. And then more and more people would call, like they called me from Napa, Burlingame, San Francisco. I was traveling all over the Bay Area to teach. I was the only one around that did that except for the Baptiste, and they didn't travel. People came to them. And I thought, no, it's good to take the yoga out into the world so people know what it is, and then they're more likely to come to a center that's established. So I started that and brought teachers in to help, and then they asked me to start teaching teachers. People would come to me and say, I want to be a yoga teacher. So then I was forced into doing teachers trainings and and to communicate with them. I started a newsletter, which eventually became the Yoga Journal.
I know, but wait.
And I started
Wait a second. Let me stop you for a second, because I want to get to Yoga Journal, but I want to ask you first, like, at that time in the 50s, when you were first doing these teachings, even before you started doing the teacher training, were people coming there thinking of yoga as a fitness thing or more as a meditative thing?
Oh, no, as a meditative lifestyle. Yeah, that's how yoga, I think you know that, Jay. It was originally taught as a lifestyle. And we talked about diet and various things. It wasn't done as fitness. No, it wasn't associated with fitness at that time.
Well, when I came to the early 90s, it still had that. Like, I got into yoga because I wanted inner peace, not work out. That's exactly why I got into it. Yeah. I wanted to find that serenity and inner peace. And I tell the story of how that first yoga teacher in the middle 50s, when I was only 15, and how he went to demonstrate the alternate nostril breath, Nadi Shodhana, and the way his hand moved through space was totally, my whole being became peaceful. Just watching how his hand moved through space. It was deliberate. It's like his mind did not stray as he moved his hand. And by the time he got his thumb and forefinger up to his nostrils, all I could say inside was, I want that. I want that peace. I want that serenity. I want that. And the name of that was yoga. So that got me started. Well, I know that inspiration of that feeling. And I
Yeah.
So you're called to teach, but you hadn't done any formal teacher training. There was no formal teacher training at that time.
No, I started the first non-sectarian teachers training. Even the Baptists weren't doing it at that time. And then later I found out I think, Kripalu, Amrit Desai had established a place on the East Coast. I'm not sure if it was established then. I know in the early 60s it was. And then but those were all sectarian teachers trainings. It was based around a particular guru and their methodology. And I started the first non-sectarian. and we call it the California.
How did you come up with what the training was going to be?
I just did it, in my living room. I had 12 future teachers in my living room, people who had come to me. And I have to tell you, Jay, I never advertised at all in those days. Never. Right.
And you had already a degree in naturopathy and other stuff too, right?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. It's funny you mentioned that because I'm sorry, it's a little dry air here. Hold up 1 second. Okay. I'm just having some tea. My father gave me a naturopathy degree very formally with all of his other students. And they were older people, and I was 12, and I was given a naturopathy degree.
Okay, I see. Well, I only meant that because I only said that because I know you told us you kind of grew up within your house, and so certainly you've been around a lot of people receiving instruction in lifestyle already. So it's not like you were blind. You had something you were drawing upon other than just the yoga practice you'd had even. Yes.
And I resisted it. It was a way of life in our home. But, my mother she was a physical therapist licensed, and she would have people on her treatment tables. They turned our big living room into a treatment room. And I'd have to run in and make sure there were no naked bodies, before I brought my friends in. And I wanted a normal life. I wanted to be able to have white bread, white rice.
Yes.
I wanted, bologna sandwiches on white bread with mayonnaise. Mm-hmm. And my father was a real health fanatic. And so I had to have all this healthy food, which I would be so happy to go to my friend's house and have canned spaghetti. I thought that was it,
But you came back around later on in life, right?
Yes. Well, I never really left it much, except in high school for a couple of years. And then I had to go back to the health things. So,
All right. So that makes a lot of sense. So you start this teacher training program because there's a demand. People are interested, but still like a lot of people.
They came to me. Yeah, they came to me.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, I was teaching 15 classes a week, traveling from Napa to Burlingame to San Francisco to Marin County. I was traveling everywhere, and I needed to have a substitute. And I was so happy they came to ask me because, one time my son fell off his bike and I had to rush him to the hospital, and I had to call one of the students to come and teach the class. And that's when they started coming to me about teachers training, and I was so happy to get a rest now and then. And so I started that, and it just kept growing and growing, never advertised it. It just always word of mouth. And then I had started at the California Institute for, now it's called Integral Studies, but it was California Institute for Asian Studies when I started there with the founder. He was my teacher. And I was working towards a degree, which you could get for studying Sanskrit and meditation and all of these wonderful subjects that I was interested in. And he introduced me to all these teachers that were coming from India. And so I ended up hosting them in the East Bay. And bringing them to the yoga teachers so that we could all learn more. And I even went to India to find Mr. Iyengar in 1970 because I saw his book in 1968. And I was so impressed with the philosophy, how he tied it into the asana. And I thought I need to find him because I was tying it in, but I had no teachers for that.
So
I just had to find it on my own.
So
and
I also
figure out.
I have a note here that
you
brought Swami Satchidananda here too. Did you bring Mr. Younger here first, or Swami Satchidananda here first?
Yes, Mr. Iyengar.
Yeah.
Because Swami Satchidananda had his people that had started a center in San Francisco, and I wanted to meet him, but I didn't bring him there, but I introduced him to a lot of our yoga teachers. Mm. And Swamiji was wonderful, just wonderful, how he integrated everything.
Well, let's go back to Mr. Younger. So did you just go to India and meet him and say, I want to bring you back? Or how did that happen?
I went to India and no one knew where he was. I just got an inkling from someone that he might be in Bombay. And so when my husband and I went, in the early days, a lot of Westerners were not going over there at that time. And I searched everywhere, couldn't find him. I ended up teaching and doing a demonstration for Indira Gandhi's cabinet ministers and people like that. And then I kept asking everyone. And the very last day before we were to leave India, we were back at our host in Bombay, and a woman was teaching yoga to his daughter, and I was to sit in and watch it. And finally, this woman said to me, yes, my teacher is Mr. Iyengar. Have you heard of him? And I practically grabbed her around the throat, and said, tell me, where is he? And she said he was in Pune. So we changed our reservations and we went to Pune. And the plane from Bombay to Pune just had a grassy field it landed in. It was very archaic. And I went to find him there, and she put me in touch with someone, and we went back and forth and couldn't find them, and my husband was upset. He said, we're leaving. This is it. We're leaving. No Mr. Iyengar. And so I looked up to pray to the heavens, and there the people were on the balcony that we were to meet with, motioning for us to come up. So I felt it was a sign. And they took me to see Iyengar, and he only had this little tiny kutir, little tiny house. And he taught in the living room, and then he had his bedroom. And as we walked in, he was teaching, and he was jumping on people's backs, in the forward bends. And my husband looked at me like, you want to study with him? You'll come home on a stretcher. But we sat in his bedroom and talked with him, and he told us his story, and how his wife had recently died, and he cried. And he was I just was so elated. I found him. And I brought him here to the West Coast, not knowing he had been going to the East Coast. I brought him to the West Coast, and we only had about 40 teachers in that first class, that most of them I had rooted out in different parts of the Bay Area, and then the ones I had been teaching. And I felt the alignment was the next step for yoga teachers. And then after almost 10 years of being involved with that and being very close to Mr. Iyengar, when he would come back and stay with us, and I would go to India for his opening of the center, and we would travel together. I would go with him to Bombay, and then he helped me establish the asana curriculum for the first California Institute for Yoga Teachers Training that I started. And I had started already the
Let
California.
me stop you before we get to the California Yoga Teachers.
Yeah.
I'm curious. You just made a statement that I think is very interesting. You said that you thought that alignment was the next step. And I'm curious why.
Yeah.
You talked about inner peace. So what did alignment have to do with inner peace?
Well, because I was seeing, I again knew Swami Vishnu, and I saw his people hurting themselves all the time.
Oh.
And I thought, there's got to be another answer to this, because people were doing back bends, for instance, just for the fourth and fifth lumbar vertebra. Mm-hmm. They weren't using the entire spectrum of the spine to bend back, and they were wearing it out. Young kids were doing that. So I thought
the physical part of practice started to become emphasized more, and you thought that Mr. Iyengar was being smarter about that? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and how he incorporated the philosophy into the asana. Now, because I told him that was so important to me, whenever I was in a class, he would do that. But then other people tell me when I wasn't in a class, he wouldn't do so much of that. It was more physical. Mm-hmm. And so, I loved our discussions on the spiritual aspects. I loved that, talking to him about that. But that's when we were traveling, and, not many people could hear his answers to my questions. Mm-hmm. But I have to say, I felt that was the next step, but not the only step and not the end step. Do you know what I'm saying?
I understand. Were you involved in, I have a note here that you founded his not-for-profit, right? Light on Yoga Foundation, is that right?
I started it, yes. It was originally Light on Yoga Foundation, and then I started the first teacher's training that became the Iyengar Training School in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. They changed the name, and it became the BKS Iyengar Association of Northern California.
Well, I know when I first got to yoga, the Iyengar training was the gold standard. It took years to do, and they were kind of doing those training of teachers before there was any kind of 200-hour training or anything like that.
Yes, I know. And he was, one trip, he brought me the certificates that he was working on with people in India for yoga teacher training certificates, He was going to certify. And I looked at him, and he looked very sheepish, because I said, Mr. Iyengar, you've seen all my certificates I have from all these different teachers, and you made fun of them, and you told me you would never give out a certificate. You'd never do that. And I said, Mr. Iyengar, what is this? I looked on our dining room table. He had laid them out. And he looked so ashamed. And basically, I think he wanted me to choose one. He wanted me to really set up the U.S. certification program. And I couldn't do it. I could not in consciousness do it, because earlier my husband and I had gone to one of our trips to England. He had me go to see what they do in the trainings and how they certify teachers. And when I saw it, I was so upset. I went into the ladies' room and just sobbed. And I cried and sobbed, and that yoga had come to this, that how the knee is aligned over the inner ankle, and that this will determine if a teacher can do that in their own body or not. And I said to the teachers there, he had me teaching his teachers all over England when we lived there a year. And he would, they would base it all on the physical. And I finally said to the teachers, but what about the heart and the soul of a teacher? I said, yoga teaching is a calling. And I said, it's a calling. And I said, you cannot base it just on what a person can do with their own body. Some of the greatest teachers who have opened the minds, the hearts of people, can't do any of that. So that's when I came back from England, and I thought, I can't do this anymore. And one day in India, I said to Mr. Iyengar, I said, you teach pranayama, but it's separate from asana. And the way I learned asana was through the breathing, that the posture followed the breath. And he looked at me and he said, first you get the pose and then you get the breath. And I said, Mr. Iyengar, will any of us ever get the pose? He said, no. And then I felt my throat constrict. I couldn't breathe. And I said, I have to go on for 10 more years and not breathe. And those things added up. And finally, I thought, I don't feel good. I didn't feel good doing Iyengar yoga, where originally with the Baptiste, I felt great. It rebuilt, it rewired me. I had superhuman energy over life, and I loved the alignment, and I loved combining the philosophy with it all, but we weren't breathing, and I found my inner body was shutting down. That's all I can say.
Well, I think it's very interesting, and it purports with other people's stories that have been on the show before too. It does seem like things started to really blossom and grow in America, and things got codified and even sort of standardized in certain ways. And I know when I talked with Judith Hanson-Lassiter and I talked with Donna Fari, who were both over there on the West Coast too, they both talked about how when they left their association with the Iyengar, had to do not even so much with what you're talking about, but with other stuff which relates to a lot of what's happening now in terms of sexual abuse and teachers not behaving properly and that kind of getting covered up and there not being any way for it to be addressed in the organization. Were you privy to any of that?
A lot of those early teachers like Manus Manos, they were, and Ramanand Patel and even Judith, they came to my yoga classes. And then I was the one that brought them to Iyengar. And Judith didn't want to come to the workshop I was organizing for Iyengar. And she said, I don't know. I said, Judith, it's really our next step. It's very important that you come. And so she did. And then she liked it and she really went for it, And Manuso came because he had not met Iyengar yet. He came to I had Friday classes for yoga teachers in the yoga room in my home in Oakland. And so Manuso was there. He had a very flexible body. And what he needed was the strength to match the flexibility. And then Ramanand would come over and meet me to see if I was really new Iyengar. And so all these people came to the workshops that I established for Iyengar after. And then they went over to India to study with him. And, but at first people were, some were eager to learn from him and others were a bit skeptical. So basically, Jay, I felt responsible for what happened in the yoga world, how people closed off to more of the spiritual, trying to be little Iyengars, and how they didn't have that balance anymore. And I went through a fanatical period where I didn't have that balance, where I used to. But I remember going into a yoga class one day, and I turned on the lights, and I brought in the boards and the straps and everything. It looked like I was going to torture them, they thought. And then after a few times, several weeks of teaching what I thought was the Iyengar method, which it was in those days. And I stopped talking about the philosophy and the lifestyle. And I remember one day one of the teachers said to one of the students said to the one next to her, I wish you'd go away and find her next guru. This Iyengar method is killing me. I mean, I thought that was rather funny. I thought, that's loyalty for you. They'll stick through everything.
Well, it's also interesting.
So I felt responsible. I was the first one in the Bay Area to be teaching this. And then I would travel to Seattle and I was asked to go all over teaching the Iyengar method. And people who had a more balanced method suddenly got into the Iyengar because that's what I introduced to them, and they liked it. And all of a sudden, it was going into more of that approach and more militaristic. And it wasn't using the breathing, which I wasn't at that time. And I saw what was happening. We were all closing down spiritually. I couldn't access those inner worlds that I once did through yoga. I couldn't go into those altered states of consciousness anymore. And so I blamed myself. And then I thought, because I had created this monster, I guess, and that we had gotten so far afield from the original yoga that I felt I needed to create a balance. And so I started Unity in Yoga. And we were giving conferences, which we invited teachers that would have a more balanced approach to it. So I did that in response to what I had created before. You know, not making it wrong. I felt it was a step that we go through, but that we don't stay there. So that we combine it with the breathing and everything. So I started, in later years, started teaching the breathing with asana again, but with the alignment, and coming into the alignment organically, not from the outside in, but letting it unfold from the inside out, from the breath.
Well, you're speaking my language. My practice is largely inspired by Desikachar, and I know you had a chance to study.
Yeah.
I also saw that you studied with Indra.
Oh, I love Desikacharya.
So how did you meet him? Is this after your parting from Iyengar method, or when did you come into contact with him?
Well, I was still involved with Iyengar, and I was just starting Unity in Yoga, but we didn't have the name for it yet. And Swami Satchidananda said, I must go to Zenal, Switzerland for the European Yoga Federation Yoga Conference. And so I went, and Mr. Desikacharya was speaking there. And I was very impressed. He was very angry at the group. That people were plastering Om on everything. You know, they were putting it on shirts and things like that. And he talked about it being a very sacred symbol that we shouldn't do that to. And then he talked about the Sutra Antasya Vachakaha Pranavaha in the Yoga Sutras, which when they say the name of Ishvara is Om, and he was trying to tell people, and he was very angry at that time about that. And he said, it doesn't say Om, it says Pranava, which Prav is to bring forth and Nava is the name. And he said, this is to bring forth the name, but Patanjali didn't say the name of Om. So I was fascinated with his wonderful teachings. And then later in the conference, near the end of the conference, I got a private meeting with him, and I invited him to come, that I wanted to host him in the United States on the West Coast and have him bring more of the spiritual teachings as he was doing. And he said, I can't go because you are well known as the hostess who brought forth Mr. Iyengar, brought forth his work in the United States, and it would be, what would you call that, Jay?
Inappropriate?
In conflict. There would be a conflict of interest. And he said, and besides, I don't agree with you. The people in the United States are not interested in the spiritual teaching. I had told him that they were hungry for it because it was being lost from the original way yoga was taught. And they were just hungry. And he said, no, I don't agree with you. That's not true. Now, it was many years later that
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.